credit. Sorry.
Oh.
No.
In that case.
Only when it's right before Christmas. There's no extra credit in the summer. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to the Dale Center's annual McCarthy Lecture, founded in 2006 through the generous support of Drs. Richard McCarthy and Craig Howard, both of whom are here tonight. So if you see them, wave at them and tell them thank you. The McCarthy Lecture brings top scholars in the field of military history every year to speak here at Southern Miss to students and to interested members of the community. Prior speakers have included Sebastian Younger, Jeffrey Gray, Beth Bailey, Brian Lynn, Dennis Showalter, just to name a few. And we are super pleased to be able to launch this lecture series again after a COVID hiatus. Lots of things on campus had a COVID hiatus, and we're launching it with a bang with an embarrassment of scholarly riches. Tonight we bring you three of the leading scholars on World War II, always the hottest of hot military topics, to discuss that war with you. The form the evening will take is as follows. Each of our panelists will make a short presentation geared to their specialty area. Then I will hustle back up here to the stage, lob a couple of hopefully wide-ranging softball-y questions, and then we will open the floor to the audience for perhaps harder questions. Who knows? I'm going to introduce all three of our panelists at this time in the order in which they'll speak, and then they'll commence to speaking. Allison Abra is the Warden and Vice Chancellor of St. John's College and an adjunct professor of history at the University of Manitoba. She was previously Associate Professor of History at some place called the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society at some university called Southern Miss, where from 2019 to 2021 she was the Buford Blunt Professor of Military History. She's a historian of women, gender, popular culture, and emotion in Britain during the era of the two world wars, and the author of Dancing in the English Style, Consumption, Americanization, and National Identity in Britain. And for her party, we all had to dance, which was quite the spectacle. Her current work is an emotional history of British secret agents during World War II, and Dr. Abra is indeed a veteran of the McCarthy Lecture series of the past. Rob Citino is an award-winning military historian and author, and the winner of the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize from the Society for Military History, the Society's highest honor. He's currently the senior historian at the World War II Museum in New Orleans. He's written far too many books for me to mention here, so I'll just mention a couple. The German Way of War, from the 30 Years' War to the Third Reich, and Path to Blitzkrieg, Doctrine and Training in the German Army. He too is a veteran of the McCarthy Lecture series. We like to bring back good people. Michael Neiberg is a professor of history and chair of war studies at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His published works specialize on the First and Second World Wars in global context. His Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, won the Harry Truman Prize. The Wall Street Journal named his Dance of the Furies, Europe and the Outbreak of World War II, as one of the 5 best books ever written about the war. And there's been more than 5, so that's high praise. His latest book is When France Fell, the Vichy Crisis and the Fate of the Anglo-American Relationship, which won a 2022 Society for Military History Distinguished Book Prize in 2017. I'm going to mess this up, Michael, I'm sorry. He was awarded the Medal d'Or Rayonnement Culturelle from the Renaissance Française, an organization whose name is unpronounceable and was founded by French President Poincaré in 1915 to keep French culture alive during the First World War. And as Kyle just reminded me, Michael was on the very first McCarthy Lecture series in 2006. So with that, please welcome our panelists. And
it's me first, right? Is this our clicker?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Whoa, watch
Yeah.
it.
Okay. Wait, am I going to stay here? Yeah. That's right.
I
I'm
think it'd be
sorry.
best because
You told me that, Kyle.
Because the mics are, yeah, because
you've
Okay.
done this before.
Yes. No, but normally we stand. Yeah, okay.
you used to make a stand. No.
Exactly. So, okay. Yeah? What? Oh, yes. It's not working. Oh, no, not this one. Yay!
There you go.
Okay. Okay, perfect. So is this my first slide? Because that's not the one I sent you. Okay. So, okay. There we go. Oh, there they are. Peter and Odette. Okay. So thank you so much to the Dale Center for inviting me to participate in this. I am honored to be in such lofty company with Mike and Rob. And I was thinking as I was preparing for this that the last time that I was in this building, I was going to say standing at a podium, but I'm not standing at a podium, was on March 12th, 2020, when they had just announced that the university was shutting down, and I was actually talking to my World War II class about the fact that we were going to have extended spring break and then see what kind of happened. And then we all know what happened, and then somewhere along the way I got a new job, and so it's very nice to be back here talking to people, because I feel like I didn't get a lot of closure. So I came to, and you know what, I'm going to set a timer because I have been cutting this thing, but I have no idea how long it is, and I do not want to blow past my time here, so, okay.
That's a good idea.
Yes, okay. I came to the study of World War II through my training as a social and cultural historian of modern Britain, although during my time here at USM, I also became increasingly engaged in and influenced by the scholarship and methodologies in war and society and military history through my wonderful colleagues in the Dale Center and my wonderful students who I got to learn alongside in many cases in graduate seminars. I'm especially interested in the war as a moment of significant social transformation, especially for women. And I've done a lot of work, as you heard, on popular culture during the war, as in my book on dancing, and especially media and leisure's relationship to national identity construction. In my current work, though, I'm engaging with one of the newer approaches to studying World War II, and indeed to studying military history or history in general, which is the study of emotions. In the last few years, the history of emotions has become a burgeoning field in historical scholarship. Shout out to the medievalists who really got us going here. It's also been very prominent in my home field of British history. And now increasingly military historians are starting to explore what effect emotions had on the experience and conduct of armed conflict, how what soldiers, civilians, and policymakers felt shaped the course of wartime events. And so here are a few recent examples from British and American history. The historian Claire Langhammer, who edited Total War and Emotional History, has described World War II in particular as an emotional watershed, a phrase I really like. She argued that for the British, feelings of love, this is a quote, hatred and anger were deployed both in the service of patriotism and to give individual meaning to national duty. The containment, regulation, and management of emotions such as grief and fear also became an important part of contributing to the war effort, especially for the British. So think about the stiff upper lip or the keep calm and carry on. Those are emotional responses to making war. So what I am doing is to use this methodology to re-examine the French section of the Special Operations Executive. As many of you may know, was a branch of British intelligence that sent agents into territories occupied by the Axis powers to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage and to supply and coordinate local resistance. And what I'm investigating is how the emotional experiences and interpersonal relationships between these agents, many of whom were women, shaped the SOE's military operations and effectiveness. And so the broader study focuses on friendship, as well as familial love between brothers and sisters, parents and children, as well as romantic love. And so that's what I thought I would talk a little bit about today, because it's the sexy part that people find fun. How potential and actual romantic and sexual relationships between F-section agents influence training practices for this agency and operational decisions, and how agent romances affected operations in France and shaped situations of arrest, interrogation, and imprisonment. And what I have found is that significant numbers of SOE agents form temporary or permanent romantic or sexual attachments during their service, with each other or with resistance allies and other people they encountered in the field. And it's arguably inevitable if you stop and think about it. During training or on a mission, they lived and worked in close quarters. They were prohibited from confiding the true nature of their activities, even to their closest friends. But the work also contributed to a need to find intimacy where they could, and the intensity and danger of their work contributed to that need even more. Agents Francis Kammertz and Christina Skarbek, for instance, began a sexual relationship in the immediate aftermath of surviving a German air raid. In his memoir, Kammertz recalled, "We were absolutely certain we were going to die the next day. It was all over. This was the end. The hotel was on fire, bombs were falling, German troops were gathering on the side of the mountain, and we simply went into each other's arms." The evolution and structure of SOE and its French section also promoted a culture where close bonds developed between agents and other personnel, and also the possibility of romantic attachments the possibility was greater in SOE than other parts of the British military that this would happen because of the fact that it was a less homosocial environment. And of course, heterosexual relationships did not have the same social, political, and indeed legal condemnations as homosexual relationships did during this period. And so SOE was clearly aware of the possibility, and the evolution of their operational practices and training practices demonstrated their concerns that romantic or sexual relationships could impair an individual agent's effectiveness and the effectiveness of the organization as a whole. They had major concerns about security and actually employed a few quote-unquote honey traps to test potential agents as to whether or not they were prone to pillow talk, although seemingly these encounters rarely actually progressed to sex, but it was just kind of try and pick that guy up at a bar and see what he will tell you. And they also had concerns about relationships between their agents and actively sought to keep them from serving together, although sometimes failed in that regard. After the war, the head of F Section, Maurice Buckmaster, told the Imperial War Museum that while he thought it was important that agents in a network in France get on well together, he tried to create groups wherein, quote, the organizer wouldn't want to go to bed with the courier the whole time. So these decisions also affected recruitment and training assessments. And an illustrative case here is that of Sonia Butt and Guy Deltois, who met and fell in love in the course of training as agents, and ultimately got married between the time that they trained and were supposed to be sent to France together, and Buckmaster said, okay, you're not going together anymore. He was concerned about especially a married couple serving in the field together and being used against each other in an interrogation context should they be captured. And there was a whole thing where Sonia then said, well, if I'm not going with Guy, I'm not going at all, and then eventually changed her mind, and they did go to the field to separate places, where incidentally she started a romance with someone else, but ended up with Guy in the end. They also are illustrative of how this affected training decisions, though, because it's very clear that Sonia's instructors were very concerned about this relationship during training, writing in one of her reports that this student is at present very much in love with Deltois, and her entire life revolves around this fact, with all other considerations subordinated to it. If she works with him, it is doubtful whether the arrangement would be good for either of them. If, on the other hand, she was separated from him, she would not prove at all efficient. In these circumstances, it is doubtful whether she should be employed. I would also note, though, that there is nothing like that in his reports. And so there's clearly a gender issue here going on where there was this idea that, you know, romance and love was much more likely to affect a woman's behavior in the field than a male agent's, although I have also found cases of male agents being denied going to the field with someone that they had expressed romantic interest in as well, so it seems to have been kind of a personality thing. So while F-section leaders could analyze an agent's romantic feelings and sexual behavior as part of training and intervene to prevent couples or would-be couples from entering the field together, they really couldn't do much about it once a couple was already in the field or found each other once they were over there. And so with the time I have left, I just want to tell you a little bit about one such case, which was Peter Churchill and Odette Sansom. He was the organizer of a network in the south of France, and Odette was his courier. And what they tell us is that agents could be just as mindful as SOE leaders about the effect their romances could potentially have. While it seemed that they were kind of immediately attracted to each other, Churchill said in his memoir that he didn't act on his feelings for the whole time that they were in the field because, quote, my singleness of purpose in regard to the war was such that I could only betray my feelings for her by the merest hint. So he's trying to practice this emotional self-management. What they also show us is that intimacy between agents could actually provide some tactical advantages because they often presented as a couple in the field, which provided greater camouflage, particularly for Peter, since there were not a lot of men of military service age in France during the war for all kinds of reasons, just walking the streets. And it got them out of a number of tight spots. Like on one occasion, they got stopped at a French checkpoint. And their driver said, oh, I'm just, looking after this couple, giving them some time alone, and they were able to imply that they were headed to a sexual tryst instead of to meet an airplane. But if they're provided advantages, there are also clear evidence from their case as well as others I could speak to in Q&A that these romances did sometimes undermine F section's operational effectiveness and agents' personal security. Churchill has another incident in his memoir where he talks about them having to flee from the Germans arriving on the scene when they were there to meet a plane. And he kind of paused in his own getaway to make sure Odette had gotten away first, which was a relatively minor lapse. But there's also some speculation after the war that one of the reasons that Odette stayed in place in the Alps, where they were then stationed when Peter had gone back to London, was to wait for him to return, even though she actually knew that a German counterintelligence officer knew where they were, right? So probably that's the reason they got captured, which they did. And so the last thing I would say about this is that their evolving romantic relationship also ended up being deeply involved in their experience of capture, interrogation, and imprisonment, and again, with sort of similarly ambiguous effects. Eventually, they were both transferred to the notorious Fresnes prison in Paris, during which time they were interrogated by the Gestapo, and Odette was brutally tortured. They were later separated and sent to different concentration camps, but they survived the war in part, or perhaps in large part, because Odette managed to convince the Germans that Peter Churchill was a relation of the British Prime Minister, which he was not, and that she was his wife. And the kind of end to this story is that he then got more prominent treatment, although still very terrible treatment, and Odette was actually brought with the Commandant of Ravensbrück when he went to surrender to the Allies at the end of the war, hoping he would get some consideration. And she was like, I'm not actually Churchill's niece, but have fun, yeah. So prior to these events, though, the arrest and the end of their activities in the field also enabled them to finally give voice to their love for one another. And in his memoir, Churchill wrote that that was when he fully realized the extent of his admiration and love for Odette when they were being transferred to prison. And through the kind of intervention of some third parties who seemed to, find them sort of adorable, I guess, or, have some sympathy for them, they, were able to interact for a while in prison, making plans for the future, discussing marriage. But they also worried more about each other, and it affected their behavior. Churchill kind of didn't try to break out of prison at one point because he was very worried about what would happen to her. And when she was tortured and he was not, she kept it from him and told others to keep it from him because she didn't want him to do something foolish in her words. So being in love in captivity introduced new anxieties that wouldn't have otherwise been there and new dangers that would not have otherwise been there if they had not had this relationship. But it also provided them a reason to keep going. They found a lot of comfort and reassurance from the moments that they were able to see each other, and Churchill described that as an oasis of happiness such as I had never known. So owing to this fake Churchill connection, they survived the war, and following their release were reunited in London. Odette was already married, other parts of the story. So she divorced her husband and married Churchill the following year. And you can see here that their story was subject of intense public interest. And in the Q&A or whenever people are curious, I'm also very interested in that, sort of representations of romance in post-war accounts of the SOE. But hopefully what I've been able to show today is that the romantic histories of these agents are important beyond their intrinsic dramatic or gossipy value, which they certainly have. Love, along with the attendant feelings of joy, pain, fear, and grief, were deeply embedded in the experiences of many men and women who served as secret agents during the war, and these emotions affected the conduct and outcome of wartime events, which has to be equally true for pretty much everybody that lived through the war, that their emotional experiences shaped what happened. So, thank you.
So, Allison, you've seen the end of the affair?
Yes. Yeah.
They're in a room and it's being bombed and it's on fire and they just kind of fall into each other's arms.
Exactly. Apparently, it happened a lot.
Apparently, it's a thing.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that very, very interesting talk. Well, I read on tanks.
Yes.
Love.
Now for something completely different. Yeah.
So now for something completely different. The philosophers tell us that all life is change, and we think that that's true in many ways, but But one thing that never changes is the avalanche of books and articles that comes out every year on World War II. I am the senior historian at the National World War II Museum, and one of the things I'm supposed to do is keep track of just what is being written on World War II, what our audience is interested in reading, what authors we should bring to the museum to speak. We have a steady diet of these kinds of speaker events. And so I have to keep my kind of finger on the pulse. You know, I used to equate interest in World War II, publishing interest in World War II, with a couple of other areas. Napoleon was huge for many years, kind of ruled the roost in the 19th and early 20th century. The American Civil War, of course, still going strong. But I think now I would say that World War II has even surpassed the American Civil War just in terms of the sheer number of books that have been devoted to it, are being devoted to it, and will continue to be in the next decades. You know, it's interesting if you think about it. We spoke to the graduate students earlier, so we gave away all of our good material. So you'll have to hear some of these things again. It's interesting if you think about this. Today in 2023, we are as far away from World War II as World War II was from the Civil War. I'm going to take the three benchmark dates. We're in 2023 and subtract 80, you're in 1943, you're in the middle of World War II. And subtract 80 from that, and you're in 1863, and you're fighting the Battle of Gettysburg, and you're in the middle of the Civil War. So I don't know, perhaps World War II's time has finally come. We think of it as modern. Think of American Civil War seems old to many of us. World War II still seems modern, but of course World War II is now very, very old as well. In a field this gigantic, it's very difficult, I think, to isolate major trends in new directions. There's an elephant, and he makes a little move to the left. And is that a trend? Well, we'll have to see if he makes more moves to the left. Then I'll make him maybe a recovery move to the right. Now he's still heading in the same direction. It's very difficult when you have a behemoth to say exactly where the behemoth is going. But again, that's what they pay me to do in my job at the National World War II Museum. So I thought I'd offer a few thoughts here. Now, please note, in the museum world, we call it the public history world, we try to cater to the general audience who's interested in history, rather than to fellow scholars. So public as opposed to academic history. I was telling the graduate students today, your audience right now is very small, the 3 professors on your committee. If they like you, you're a success. And then you'll write your dissertation, hopefully a first book, and that's still probably going to be written for the other scholars in the field, so maybe a few hundred people. And if they like it, a couple of them will review it in the pertinent journals, and you'll be a success. But you know, in public history, you can sell 150,000 copies of a book or 1 million copies of your book. It's entirely possible. And that's where the museum sits. I mean, I think that's where museums sit in general. We want to obviously have good scholarship and be saying the right things and be telling the truth. And at the same point, we also want to be appealing to the broadest audience. And appealing to the broad audience today, I hope I don't have to tell people in this room, it's a fractious time in our country's history, and you never know what's going to get somebody angry. This is making what you think is a completely innocuous statement, and you might have a fight on your hands. We can talk about that, as Allison said in the Q&A. So I'll be mentioning some books for you today in this short talk that are aimed at the broadest possible readership rather than the academic market. Having said that, I can't stress enough that books in the public history field should be read by everyone. And I can guarantee you a happier and healthier and more fulfilled life if you read every last book I'm about to point out to you, even though they are not, strictly speaking, scholarly books. My slides are nowhere near as interesting as Allison's. I'll just say that from the get. But let's, oh, and there I am. Very nice. Thank you for the logo. Appreciate it. We paid good money for that logo, and I'm glad to see it displayed. So let me look at 2 distinct groups of books published in the recent years, really since the turn of the millennium, and divide them 2 distinct groups. And the 2 distinct groups being what we kind of call the old military history, which is guns and tanks and action on the battlefields and the decisions of generals and the arguments between the national leaders and the conferences that took place, at least on the Allied side, throughout the war. Traditional military history, sometimes gently mocked as drum and trumpet history. There's not too many drums and trumpets in World War II, but it's tanks and aircraft, certainly. Well, first, with that group of books, traditional books about battles and campaigns are having a heyday. In the academic area, we sometimes say, gee, no one does traditional military history anymore, which is also not true. But they definitely do it in the public sphere and do it con brio. This is the old school of military history, like my Telecaster at home. And it's still going strong, and it's still making a lot of noise. If you're an active author in this area today, in fact, you don't just grace us with a single book. If you have any claim to gravitas, you write a trilogy. So the development probably began, it's always difficult to say, with Rick Atkinson, author Rick Atkinson and his Liberation trilogy. I have here the picture of the third volume in that trilogy. It's a history of the U.S. Army in the European theater of war in World War II. Rick brought out an Army at Dawn in 2002 about the battles in North Africa. There's a graduate student in here writing a dissertation on Lloyd Friedendahl, and you probably know this book very well. The second volume, The Day of Battle, which came out in 2007, about the fighting in Italy, and then The Guns at Last Light here in 2013, the sort of D-Day landing all the way up to the destruction of the swastika over the German parade field, the video that everyone's always seen. Rick's a fantastic writer, and the Pulitzer Committee agrees with that statement. So he did very, very well with these books. They did sell in the hundreds of thousands of copies, maybe more than that in paperback. And he's already off to another one. If you're a Rick Atkinson fan, that he's writing a trilogy on the American Revolution. Brought out The British Are Coming 2019. He's told me privately, I'm not sure why I agreed to write a trilogy. When you sign up for a trilogy, you're signing a decade of your life away, but I'm confident Rick will take care of business, as he always does. But alongside Rick, that's land warfare, if that's your thing. There's author Ian Toll, who has written a Pacific War trilogy. I have all three of them here in the gift box that you can get for Christmas. Pacific Crucible, 2011, The Conquering Tide, 2015, and Twilight of the Gods, 2020. Operational military history is where you get the great titles for books, there's no doubt. I'm going to write a book someday, called Twilight of the Gods. Don't know what it's about, but I've got my title already picked out for me. Good stuff here. Good readable narrative history of the war at sea in World War II. Well, it's happening on the other side of the Atlantic. There's our friend Peter Caddick Adams, a British author who's chimed in with his trilogy on the war in Europe. Snow and Steel on the Battle of the Bulge, Sand and Steel on D-Day, and Fire and Steel, if you're noticing a trend. There's Patrick's into steel. And those books have come out between 2015 and 2022. His fellow Brit, our friend James Holland, who you and I were just talking about. His fellow Brit, James Holland, has a trilogy, The Rise of Germany on the early war years, The Allies Strike Back on the middle years of the war, and then Normandy 1944 on D-Day to the end of the war, and there's The Allies Strike Back for you. Hell, I've even written one. I have a trilogy on the Wehrmacht. Death of the Wehrmacht on the 1942 battles. I'm not putting that up on the screen. The Wehrmacht retreats on 1943, and then the Wehrmacht's last stand on 1944-45. So that's old school military history, and boy, you can make a pile of money and win a gigantic reading audience, and publishing houses are eager for it. So I know many of you are going to be getting PhDs in the academic sphere, and also think about that big audience out there that doesn't have PhDs and might want to read some decent history, because you can really make an impact there. Well, alongside that old school, as I called it, is a new one. We call it the new military history. It's war and society, it's race and gender, class. It can involve the environment. In a sense, there's an offshoot of it, the history of memory, how we memorialize various aspects of war. New military history. I try not to use the term anymore. It's been around since the 60s. So, if you think the Beatles' first album is new, then the new military history is for you. But I think it's just a different variety of military history, which tends not to look at the battlefield, but look at the people who actually fought on the battlefield. Get to know something about them besides the caliber of the gun they were carrying and the size of the tank. So, I think this is extremely valid and very interesting history as well. So especially here, books on women in World War II, on the African American experience, and the experience of other marginalized or minority groups. These are all stories, I hope we can agree around this intellectual table we're sitting at, that have gone untold for far too long. We're very concerned at the museum, National World War II Museum, that we tell a certain version of the war, which is largely a version of its soldiers, which is largely a version then of white Americans. But we're in the middle of New Orleans, for heaven's sake. It's a minority city, is that the term? Correct term? And there's an eager African-American audience in New Orleans who would love to know more about World War II and the history of their country. We want to make sure that we're serving them as well. So I'd recommend the almost still brand new book, I think relatively speaking. Let me try that. There we go. By Matt Delmont. Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II. at home and abroad. Matt is a deep thinker and a really great writer. He's been blogging for many years, and this book goes down smoothly. It's got some serious history in it, but also goes down very smoothly in the reading, in my opinion. He tells the story here of the so-called double victory campaign. That is the African Americans who were simultaneously, as they saw it, fighting against Hitler overseas, or Tojo, or however you parse the Japanese war overseas, but they're also fighting the war against racism and Jim Crow laws at home. So one of the founders of the National World War II Museum is one of the best-selling historians of all time, Stephen Ambrose. Stephen Ambrose famously said, we fought a war against the worst racist of all time, Adolf Hitler, and did so with a segregated army. It's the paradox, the irony of American history, and that's the subject of Matt's book. I can't recommend this too highly. It's really great stuff. I also recommend the new book by Mari Ader, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line, Untold Stories of the Women Who Changed the Course of World War II. The more you're in the popular history sphere, the more ebullient and overstated your book title will be, especially what comes after the colon. It's always about changing the course of history, changing the course of World War II. Ader writes with authority. These are vignettes. This is not, to me, this does not break new scholarly ground, but it tells some interesting and relatively unknown stories. And she writes with authority because she's probably used to that, I would say. She's a retired U.S. Army Major General. Let me turn off my 10-minute mark, and I'll get to the end of this very briefly. So Mari Ader, The Girls Who Stepped Out of Line. Finally, I would note that Japanese American incarceration or internment is also a very, very hot topic right now. And let me just stop. There we go. And here I point to the wonderful book by Shirley Higuchi. It's called Setsuko's Secret, Heart Mountain and the Legacy of the Japanese American Incarceration. Shirley is Japanese American. She grew up in a town that's near and dear to many of us, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Yay. She didn't know anything of what her parents had gone through in World War II. She thought Heart Mountain was some kind of resort out in the Rockies where her parents met. That's how they mediated it to her. When her mother was near death, she told Shirley the story of what had happened at Heart Mountain about being dragged out of your homes, told to get a single suitcase, given almost no time, thrown onto a train, dumped off in the middle of nowhere, and forced to make do as best you can. This book works on many, many levels. It's very serious history and history of memory. It's also a story. It's one young woman, adult story, growing up and sort of finding herself, finding her family's story. She is now Shirley Higuchi is the director, I think is her title, of the Heart Mountain Foundation. So she oversees that former Japanese internment camp. They have an interpretive center, a nice little museum there, an archive, and she's doing good work there. Now, I'll end by identifying just in the next couple of minutes the clear winner amongst current trends in World War II. The winner by a mile, if you ask me. And what Allison said, I think, just confirms what I'm about to say to you. If you absolutely, positively want to get a book published, here's what you do. Find a resistance fighter, a female resistance fighter in World War II. Get a quote from Hitler, even if it's apocryphal or specious, calling her the most dangerous woman in Europe, or my most dangerous enemy, or the Third Reich's greatest enemy. And you've got it made. And please don't think I'm being facetious or kidding. Just ponder this list of recent publications, and I'll go through them again quickly and just say a bit. There is Madame Fourcade's Secret War, the daring young woman who led France's largest spy network against Hitler, by the redoubtable Lynn Olson, who turns out a beautiful book every 2 years. I wish I had Lynn's writing discipline. She's fantastic, and she can really write. D-Day Girls by Sarah Rose, the spies who armed the resistance, sabotaged the Nazis, and helped win World War II. Please notice that. Sonia Purnell, A Woman of No Importance, the untold story of the American spy who helped win World War II. And so those books have been published between 2019 and 2020. I mean, there's a lot more, and my time grows short, as the Ghost of Christmas Past says in the Christmas Carol. So I won't belabor the point here, but we could go through this for many, many, many more books. So, as Hunter Thompson used to say, enough of that. Thanks to Andy and Kyle for inviting us. And great to be on stage with Mike and Allison. Turn it over to you, big guy.
Thank you, sir. Well, I want to start by thanking Andy and Kyle for the chance to come back to Southern Miss and to see all the great things that the Dale Center has done. It's been a real pleasure to be back. My friends in the Post-Judge Advocate Office would also be very happy if I tell you that although I am a federal employee, or because I'm a federal employee, everything you're about to hear is my opinion, does not reflect federal government policy, and does not reflect the views of the dean, the provost, the commandant, any employee of the U.S. Army War College, or the United States government.
Wait, I have a question.
You
No,
heard me-
I don't have a question.
You heard me say that.
Yeah, I did.
I just returned about a week and a half ago from a high-level defense meetings with some of our students who are pictured here in Helsinki, Warsaw, and Paris to discuss strategy and security, NATO, in the wake of the Ukraine war. And what struck me more than anything else is that when Americans talk about these issues, we talk in terms of interests and we talk in terms of resources. When Europeans talk about these things, they talk in terms of history. So what I thought I might do in the 10 or 15 minutes that I have here is to talk about the links between Polish and Finnish history and memory of World War II and how that's impacting what they're thinking about strategy in the context of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine last year. This is one of an estimated, nobody actually knows, 1,800 World War II memorials in Warsaw alone. This is in front of their Supreme Court building, in effect. And I put some U.S. Army colonels in there so you can get a sense of just the magnitude of this. Warsaw now has a rule that unless 25 people were killed on a given spot in the city, you cannot build a new memorial. That's the kind of a city that we're talking about. The Second World War experience for the Poles, of course, is that Poland was wiped off the map for the 4th time in its history. Poles became victims of genocide at the hands of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And the little yellow slips of paper that we're wearing there, we managed to get there on the 80th anniversary of the Jewish uprising against the Nazis. And people all over Warsaw were wearing these daffodils in honor of that event. To us in the West, the Ukraine war was an event. It was a break in history. It was a shocking break from a peaceful history. To the Poles, it's a process and a continuity going back centuries. So this is what the Poles call the fourth partition of Poland, when Poland is literally taken off the map, not only by the Germans, but of course by the Russians. And I can talk a lot more about that. The historical memory in Poland is, of course, of being divided again and again by great powers. And a good friend of mine who lives in Warsaw, she's Canadian but lives with her Polish husband, very good friend of Rob's too. She and her husband in the mid-1990s, when things looked pretty good, bought a beautiful manor house and restored it. His father, that is our friend's father-in-law, said, "You made a tremendous mistake. The house is on the wrong side of the river." This was in 1995. The historical memory in Poland is that in 1939, when this was happening, nobody came to their aid, despite the fact that Britain and France had both signed collective security agreements with the Poles. So their assumption is, once again, that France won't get there this time either. Neither will the British, and certainly neither will the Germans. And although there's a great deal of hatred towards Russia in Poland, there is a tremendous amount of disappointment toward Germany, both for its last 10 years of policy towards Russia and the failure of Germany's so-called Zeitenwende, or supposed big change in its defense plans. So it is reliant upon NATO, of which, of course, it's been a member for quite a while, and is willing to welcome to Poland as many American troops as would like to be there. There are currently about 10,000 American forces there on what is known as a heel-to-toe rotation, meaning one unit moves out, the other unit smoothly moves in. The Poles are very anxious, and I think it's going to happen, to move that to a much more permanent and forward presence of American forces, including airborne units, in Poland. But if push were to come to shove, it is Poland's belief that they should be able to defend themselves rather than to rely on outside help that may or may not come. And as I mentioned, the Poles fought both the Germans and the Soviets in the Second World War. The monument on the left is to something called the Katyn Massacre in 1940, when the Soviet Red Army killed 22,000 Poles, blamed it on the Germans, and to our shame, the United States accepted that in the interest of inter-Allied solidarity until well after the war. The image on the right is inside a place called the Warsaw Citadel, the old 18th century fortress. The cases there, and they go on and on for room after room after room. These are the personal objects found on the murdered Katyn Poles, their wedding rings, the keys to their house, their pens, all the pocket knives, all of that. And it goes on for room after room after room at Katyn. For those of you that know, or those of you who have been to Warsaw, the city itself was completely wiped off the map by the Germans, going building to building, literally, while the Russians sat on the other side of the river allowing it to happen. So for the Poles, as I said, there is residual anger against the Germans and some anger for German policy today, but the real hatred, of course, is to the Russians. So what does this all mean? We spend a lot of money on defense in this country. We spend about 2%, 2.2% of our GDP. Poland is planning to spend 4% of its GDP, and Poland's economy is just outside the G20 now. It's about the 21st or 22nd largest economy in the world. 4% of that is a lot of firepower, and that's what they're going to do. They're buying 1,000 South Korean K2 tanks, plus the licenses to build them inside Poland, so they don't have to rely upon spare parts and other things coming from halfway around the world. And they're going to buy 250 American Abrams tanks, where the licensing is a little bit more complicated. They're going to go to an army of 300,000, which will represent the largest European army in NATO by far, once they get done with their modernization. They have been remarkably, incomprehensively welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, all of whom now have Polish ID cards that allows them to be Polish citizens in everything except voting rights. They can get healthcare, education, whatever is necessary with this ID card that they carry. It's really just astonishing to watch. Ukrainian flags everywhere inside Poland. More than one person told me that the Poles believe that we are already in World War III, which is a kind of scary thing to think about. And they also are doing a big effort outside that 4% of GDP to modernize bridges and ports to make sure that if the United States or NATO needs to get stuff into Poland, that the bridges can handle the tanks and the ports can handle all of the unloading if necessary. The Polish flag, as some of you probably know, most of you probably know, is red and white. The explanation one cynical person gave to me: it is white for the purity of Poland, it is red for the blood shed in its defense, and the blue represents everybody who has ever come to help us. I can tell you this, without violating any security or confidentiality, Poland, Warsaw felt to me 2 weeks ago like a city mobilizing for something. There are military officers everywhere. The hotel that we were staying in was filled with American, British, Canadian officers up and down. A lot of Canadian Air Force guys in there for some reason. I know the reason. In the Poles' estimation, there will be about 5 to 6 years of breather space while the Russian army rebuilds, when and if this Ukraine war ever ends. And then it is their firm belief that the Russians are going to try again. So the race is on in that 5 to 6 years. It was a pretty stark experience there, pretty intense and pretty stark experience. This is a picture I took in Helsinki. This is between our hotel and the embassy. You may think, why on earth would anybody take this photograph? It is the most unremarkable thing in the world. It is a World War II bunker, later converted into a parking garage, which can be converted back into a bunker on 1 week's notice. The city of Helsinki, if you own any property greater than about 10,000 square feet, whatever that equivalent is in metric, I'll let Allison handle that, I can't do it. If you own a facility like that, including our hotel, you must have a 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month plan. The entire city of Helsinki can be sheltered this way, from a natural disaster or an unnatural disaster. Every corporation in Finland has responsibilities in the event of a national emergency, whatever that might be. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but for example, the companies that produce bottled water are responsible for having enough of it on hand to provide to these bunkers if necessary, which is ironic because Finland's water is supposed to be the very best in the world, and with the plastic crisis, nobody carries bottled water around with them, but they're still doing it. It's really interesting. Finland's a really interesting place. I highly recommend you go if you get the chance. Go in summer. This is the images from the so-called Winter War. It's important to note that Finland did not fight the Nazis in World War II. They fought the Russians. And this is something that has been in their historical memory and has been in their national psyche. Also in their national psyche, although in a very uncomfortable way, many Finns fought with the Nazis against the Soviets when the war was coming to an end. Some folks in Finland would prefer not to mention that. The National Museum of Finland doesn't really talk about it. Others, of course, are willing to open up a little bit more about that. They are, as many of you I'm sure know, changing their entire view towards security in Finland, and I'll talk about that in just a second. They drove me out to a place called Salpa. If you can see in there, that's part of a defensive line that they built behind the very famous Mannerheim line. This was last fall when I was out there. It was turned over to the Ministry of Tourism to turn it into a park. It is now being turned back to the Ministry of Defense. So you can still go and tour it, but they are figuring out what to do if they actually need to operationalize this. Norway is doing the same thing with some military facilities that it has in what they call the High North. I call the freezing cold Arctic. They prefer to call it the High North for reasons I haven't quite figured out.
Get you to move there.
Yeah, they're not getting me to move there. That ain't going to happen. Though Norway has the highest percentage of its population in continental Europe that lives above the Arctic Circle. So they take defense of that region very seriously. So, as some of you may know, Finland broke with a decades-old tradition of being the neutral state between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and now is a full-fledged member of the NATO alliance. We were the first US DoD group to visit the Finnish Ministry of Defense since accession. I told our students that we planned it that way. We did not. They support for NATO membership was at 85%. In the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, it was at 22%. It is now at 85%. One of the Finns told me they were actually grateful that it wasn't higher because it would look like the North Korea effect. Right? It would look like everybody was voting 100% for it. They were actually happy that there were 8 members of parliament that voted against. Right? 188 voted for. Their motto is never again alone, words that are written over one of their fortifications in Helsinki Harbor. And they have developed this really impressive, Norway has something very, very similar, integrated network of trust, deterrence, and resilience plan. Again, every corporation has a responsibility. It is a country of about 5.5 million people, 900,000 of whom are in the Finnish reserves. It's a country of 5.5 million people with 5 million saunas also. The Finnish military, when it deployed to Afghanistan, apparently built the sauna before it built their mess hall, if it tells you what the Finns value in the world.
What does the Air Force build first, Mike?
The golf course.
So there's jokes about that.
Yeah. 57 critical tasks that this plan involves, which involves every member of the private sector, and it involves every part of the government. The Education Ministry has taken lead for 20 years now on educating Finnish children on how to spot disinformation on the internet. They're the best in the world at it, along with Estonia. They are now the NATO Center of Excellence for dealing with misinformation and dealing with cyber. Nokia, Ericsson, all those companies, by Finnish law, they have to have a defense component to it. And as it says here, they're going to go pretty high on defense too, and they're going to buy 64 F-35s, and when Sweden gets into NATO and buys a similar number, that's going to be an unbelievably important deterrent that's going to be there. So what does it all mean for us? My last slide here. It means that there is a divide in NATO between those states that live near Russia, who believe that Russia is the sole, lone, and only threat. This is a map of what's called the Enhanced Forward Presence approach, where the flags you see, the big flags, are the countries that are taking primary responsibility for deterrence in those zones. Canada has Latvia. The British have Estonia. The Germans theoretically have Lithuania, though I think they have, like, I shouldn't say this, but let's just say they have a smaller number in there than they're supposed to have. So there's a question about both the interests of those states being different from Italy, Spain, France, which typically look to the south and look to instability in Africa as their primary concern. And there is a concern among many European states that the center of gravity in Europe for NATO and for defense is continually moving east as this Ukraine crisis is ramping up. As one of the Americans said on this trip, no, the center of gravity is and always will remain in Washington, D.C. Fair point. Our World War II narrative here in the United States, and Rob talked about it, is triumphalist. It's of saving Europe twice in the World Wars and then again in the Cold War. We're going to have to adapt to the reality that our allies on this map, especially the dark blue ones, have a very different narrative of the Cold War, of the Second World War, and they are very worried about what will happen if the United States shifts its focus to the Pacific, or if a shooting war actually were to begin there, or if another presidential administration of either political party would carry through on threats to withdraw or reduce American support for NATO. They're very worried about it. We must remember, too, that the Russians have their own memory of the Second World War, a really brilliant book by a British scholar named Jade McGlynn, who has just made this point beautifully. And it's a pretty terrifying history that seems as detached from reality as Russian strategy seems detached from reality. As we say in the Army War College, you cannot build good strategy on bad history, yet that is precisely what the Russians are trying to do, and we're going to have to deal with it. So sorry to be somber at the end of this, but there is the largest war since 1945 in Europe happening as we speak. Thanks.
Great.
erstwhile host of this event, I get to toss out the first couple of questions. And I'm teaching a World War II class right now, so maybe my students ought to be taking notes on this first one, because the first one is pretty tactical in nature. The Wehrmacht and the Japanese military are regarded as some of the best militaries in the world at that time, and both got out to some pretty good starts at the beginning of the war. But at any point in the war, did the Axis actually have a chance to win, or were they doomed to defeat from the get-go?
I guess I should start with
Oh,
that.
Yes,
Yeah.
you definitely should.
You can start to the middle question and finish.
I don't know, Andy. I never thought about. No, that's a really good question. Let's talk about the Germans for a moment. The German decision to go to war in 1939 was a long shot. They had a momentary advantage, and they knew they had a momentary advantage over enemies and potential enemies, but they had to win the war quickly and win enough dramatic victories on the battlefield to force somebody, the British or the French, to come to the peace table. They were going up against big maritime powers without a navy. Usually doesn't work, and you can go way back to have that proven. And so I would say they probably had a 15% chance of winning the war when it started. And then they beat Poland really quickly. And I don't know, it didn't change the equation much because the Western powers didn't do much after that. But then they miraculously, in a very strange defeat for the French Republic, they conquered France in a matter of weeks. And now the chances probably went up to 25 or 30%. I don't know. The West still wasn't doing much. The British weren't doing much. There were some half-serious bomber raids into Western Germany that were doing absolutely no damage. So the odds might have risen there for a bit. And to improve their strategic position, they overran the Balkans very quickly in the spring of 1941. And maybe it was a 40% chance. Then they invaded the Soviet Union. We say, well, they just went down to zero. But then they completely destroyed the Red Army along the border in the first couple of months of that war. So they might have gone up to 45%. Yeah, I'm playing with these numbers. I'm making them up as I go along. I give this little talk a lot, and the numbers change constantly depending on how I feel. But the number definitely went up after the opening victories inside the Soviet Union. Then in the fall and late fall as winter came on, the wheels kind of came off that campaign, largely due to logistics. And then they suffered a huge and horrendous defeat in front of Moscow. Textbooks say the Germans got stopped in front of Moscow. They ground to a halt in front of Moscow. Yeah, then they got destroyed. I mean, it's not just, if only grinding went to a halt, then you just start up the next spring when the weather was better. But the Soviets launched a counterattack, and they took a war that the Germans had suffered almost no casualties in for the first 2 years and inflicted 1 million casualties on the Germans. And I don't think from December of 1941, Soviet counterattack in front of Moscow, I don't think the Germans had any chance of winning World War II against the Soviets and soon to be their American and British enemies as well, this grand alliance that ground them to powder. Japanese, it's a similar story. I won't bore you with the percentages because I'm making those up anyway. But the Japanese decision to go to war was a classic gamble. They felt they had been backed into a corner by U.S. policy, various kinds of economic embargoes that were preventing them from winning, they felt, this big war they were trapped in China. It's kind of, Russia and Ukraine right now. You had big hopes at the beginning of that campaign, and it just hadn't really worked out. By the summer of 1941, the Japanese had 1.5 million troops in China in a war they apparently couldn't win. It's most of the Japanese army. It will continue to be most of the Japanese army until 1945. Vast 80% of the Japanese army. So they thought, well, we'll do this. we'll conquer a vast resource area in Southeast Asia because Hitler's overrun all these European countries. Their colonies are ripe for the picking. And it made a certain amount of sense, but the American military would never permit that. The U.S. Navy would never permit that. So you had to launch a blow against the U.S. Navy, knock it out of the war long enough to create a big, gigantic Japanese-controlled empire in Southeast Asia. Indochina, Malaya, and of course the big one, Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, all that oil. So they did that, and they landed a great blow on the Americans at Pearl Harbor, but couldn't touch the American mainland. U.S. Economy went into high military production. I don't think the Japanese had a 20% chance of winning World War II at any point in the war. Frankly, neither did Franklin Roosevelt. I didn't mean to say that. Frankly, neither did President Roosevelt. That's why he said he was not worried about the Japanese threat at all. We got to worry about the Germans, third largest economy in the world, and pushing to be the second largest economy in the world. That's our most serious adversary. It's going to be Europe first. Now, the way it turned out was tough to get at Europe, so we had to devote a lot of resources to the Pacific, and if you count the atom bomb, which was used in the Pacific, then a lot of US resources went to defeat Japan. But no, the answer is no. The question you recall was, did the Axis ever have a chance to win World War II? I know, it was a long time ago.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, this is going to be a different kind of answer. No percentages.
Okay,
But
good.
I think as Rob so eloquently showed, there was a fatalism to the decision on the part of both the Germans and the Japanese to go to war in the first place, right? Kind of like there was a gamble, there was a maybe we can make this work. And I think the maybe is also tied to something I think is important to remember about the war, which is who they were fighting, right? Which is to say that, like, we always want to default to, you know, the Western allies in particular, because they include a lot of the people in this room were like, they were there to fight Nazis, and they were upset about the Holocaust, and like these kind of good war narratives, I think, color our view of how the war went, and, you know, particularly Churchillian rhetoric and fantastic speeches. I mean, the man was very pithy, there's no question, right? I think that those visions of the war sometimes blind us to the reality of the fact that maybe Hitler could have won if Britain had negotiated peace in 1940, which was certainly not off the table by any stretch of the imagination, right? Like, never surrender and all of those factors. And I also think that we need to kind of understand historical actors in their moment a little bit more in terms of, you know, the realities of what they were facing. And one specific example here that I'm thinking about is there's been some really good revisionist, often gender history of appeasement that has come out in British history lately that is basically, you know, I don't want to say apologizing for appeasement as much as kind of like helping us to better understand appeasement as, you know, something that we now think of very shamefully. Like, how could they have not stood up to Hitler, and what were they thinking, and this was so terrible. But of course, you know, hindsight is 20/20. They did not know what we know about how that war was going to go. And you know, again, when you look at it through the lens of one historian, it'll come back to me, Julie. Yes. Anyway, she wrote a really good book where she said something that has never really been looked at is the fact that, like, Neville Chamberlain was getting daily letters from women in Britain, basically saying, you know, please, Mr. Chamberlain, don't send my son to war. Please, Mr. Chamberlain, don't send my husband to war. The memory of the First World War was still so strong that you have to think about, you know, the ability or the sort of the position that people were in continuing this war and perpetuating this war. So I feel like there were potential windows where the reality of what they were facing could have created space for the Axis, but, you know, ultimately didn't for all kinds of other reasons. But that we need to understand that this was a big ask to you know, keep fighting the war, especially in the early stages when it was going very well for the Germans and the Japanese. And so paying attention to those nuances, I think, is part of the answer to Andy's question as well.
I agree.
The only thing I might add is, I mean, we talk about this all the time, there is no tactical and operational victory in war, there is only political victory, right? The military has to support what the state wants. And the Germans never figure out, I think, in either World War, what it is they want. It's just more.
What does victory look like?
So what does victory look like? The ends get away from them very quickly, and if you're going to do that, it doesn't matter what ways and means you're using, sooner or later that thing is going to collapse in and of itself. It's a fundamental failure to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Julie Gottlieb, I was feeling bad, especially if this is going to be on YouTube.
If only we had a small rectangular object
exactly.
we could look at.
Sorry, I had a very long travel day yesterday, so apologies, Julie,
No
if you ever see
excuses.
this, because I love your book.
Remember, this is being streamed out to the ether for the next
Julie got
1,000 years.
I will live in infamy.
Oh,
Nice.
nicely done.
Well, I'll hit you with the second question then. World War II had and still has a host of legacies, and I thought you guys really brought that out well in your talks. From military ones to culture ones to political ones, arguably ones we're still fighting our elections over today. In your mind, what's the most intriguing legacy of the war in the country that you study most closely? I guess we'll start with you, Dr. Abra, since you're on this end.
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, I have like a one-word answer to this, which is Brexit. Yeah, but I will say a little bit more about that. I think, you know, I cheated a little bit. Andy gave me a preview of the questions when I was chatting to him earlier, and I was thinking about this.
I didn't get that.
I know. Well, I asked, yeah. So I was thinking about this question, and it is interesting if you think about, like, the big myths of World War II, and I say myth in the sense of there are truths, there are untruths associated with them, are very much about obviously the Blitz spirit, fortitude and defiance in the face of the German bombing campaign, but also the associated People's War idea, right? That Britain in the war witnessed national unity and equality of sacrifice on such a level that it finally decimated the British class system and broke down all of these social barriers and brought everyone together. And historians have spent the last 80 years interrogating those questions in various ways. But when that idea first emerged, it was very left-leaning, right? It was very much tied to this idea that the People's War was going to lead to the people's peace, and it became the foundation of the welfare state, and was very much, creating a much more, in their hopes at least, egalitarian society. And somewhere along the way, Margaret Thatcher and other things happened to the welfare state, and now it feels like the Blitz spirit and the People's War has been co-opted by the right. Right, and Brexit and this idea of like we did it alone in 1940 and we can keep doing it alone is very much part of the Brexit narrative. And there's an imperial element to this as well that needs to be appreciated. But Mike brought up a really fascinating statistic today, right? When we were talking about this with the grad students, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but that is basically if you believe that Britain, or if you were a voter in 2016 and you believed that Britain was the most important Allied contribution in the war, you were 85% likely to vote for Brexit. Or if you had a more nuanced picture of the war and understood all of these different things, you were probably voting to stay, right? And also, believing in the European Union as one of the outcomes of the war is another piece to this as well, or the productive outcomes of the war. So that's one of the things that I've sort of witnessed being kind of sad, is the way that this narrative that did a lot of good initially, although again often being torn down because there was many ways it was not an equal society during the war or ever after, has started to be used in different ways.
Well, to me it's quite obvious. I studied Germany. And the legacy of World War II in Germany, it took a country that for 200 or 300 years had terrorized Europe with its military, especially its army. It's built around the hardcore of the Kingdom of Prussia, the most highly militarized of the 18th century kingdoms, Frederick the Great, the Prussian jackboot, constant drill, discipline, the Sparta of Europe. I understand why the Russians and the French have been terrified over the years. I really do, and especially by the mid-19th century. Germany became a behemoth, a military behemoth, by far the most powerful military country on the continent, and it could have launched an invasion of France at any time before 1914 as well, and it could and did beat Russia. We say you invade Russia, well, that's a bad idea. No one beats Russia. Well, the Germans beat Russia in World War I. They did conquer Russia, brought Russia to the negotiating table and drove them out of the war. And then, so that's militarism that has been so much a part of German society. By militarism, I mean where the military sets the standards for behavior and enjoys all sorts of social, political, and economic advantages. Being a military officer in Germany was probably one of the most beautiful existences on the planet in 1900. So it wasn't so good for a lot of the other groups in Germany, but it was good if you're an officer. Then that militarism developed into its most virulent expression after 1933. It was a lost war, which came as a shock. How could Germany lose a war? Germany's the most powerful military nation on earth and lost a war, and completely unhinged many sectors of German society. And so you have this virulent expression of a return to these militarized ways in the Third Reich. And once again, big campaigns of conquest, terrorized their neighbors. In this case, went whole hog into lunacy, into genocide, at least in the Eastern European and Russian territories that it conquered. And then they lost that war. And now, like, who are the Germans? There are many things, but I'm not worried about them as a military power. They can barely deploy a battalion into Afghanistan when they were asked to do so. Anyone ever see the beer drinking statistics for German troops deployed in Afghanistan? It's uncanny. You can't believe anybody could be drinking that much beer. And they don't have a reputation for military spit and polish. I've met my share of German officers, quite professional. I'm not drawing any broad brush here. But certainly, I don't think that Germany is ever in our lifetime going to carry out a vast campaign of conquest. And that's based on my friendship with what you might call ordinary Germans from various sectors of life. I'm sure when folks get together and have a few drinks, they make a few comments about World War II that would curl my hair. But in general, the society has become pacifist, and especially younger Germans, and even the younger Germans of the 1980s who now have kids, their kids are even more pacifist than their parents were. So that's I think there's just nothing close to what World War II did to the Germans. You know, we helped by occupying the country and completely redesigning its political system and helping it get on the path to democracy, as we did to Japan as well. So we helped, and that may be an illusion for America as well, that we can always do what we did to the Germans. Complete absolute victory, and then we'll create a democracy of you, whether you want to be or not. So that's another story. I don't study America, that's just me as an American. But I can say that the German legacy to me is the most dramatic one, from the most warlike to the most pacifist nation in the world, maybe.
This is what the Poles have been telling the Germans. If we're okay with you building an army, you should be okay
Yeah,
with you
that's
building an army.
of all
Right?
people.
There's a common threat that we have to face, and Germany's not
Yep.
not doing that for historical reasons.
Right.
Again, the language is history. It's not interest and resources.
Yes, right.
Mostly I study France, and what has been, I guess, surprising to me has been the way that France has redefined its own identity towards World War II. And you can do this pretty easily by walking around Paris and looking at the plaques that are on buildings. The old ones will say something like, from this place, 500 Jews were deported, passive voice for those of you writing, or were deported by the Germans or something like that. Much more recently, they will say things like, from this place, the Vichy government, sometimes acting with its German allies, sometimes just Vichy with no Germans involved at all, deported children or whatever. There's a monument to a place called the Veldiv, to the children massacred, Jewish children taken to this place called the Veldiv, which was an indoor bicycle track. It's gone now, but they built a lovely memorial garden there. And to read the plaques on that garden, you wouldn't know that Germany was involved in it at all, which is not far from the truth. It was the French Vichy system that was responsible for doing this. So the way that France is kind of, it's almost like, a friend of mine said, it's almost like the way France quit smoking, like almost overnight. And it's kind of done that
Really?
with its, oh yeah, like almost overnight. They just, anyway, that's another story. But they've done the same thing with Vichy. They've just kind of snapped, and it's no longer, hey, this is what the Germans made us do. It's now, look what our government did in our name. It's an illegitimate government, to be sure, a government of occupation, to be sure, but it won't work anymore just to blame the Germans. And that's been a remarkable
Yeah,
turnaround.
that's a good one. Yeah.
Well, I've got a bunch more questions, but I'm sure you guys have ones too. I saw Mac raise his hand first.
I got two statements and a question. First was when Neville Chamberlain was negotiating with Germany and Italy, there was a General Powell who was Director of Military Operations and Intelligence for Britain. And he said that Chamberlain would rally common sense people to his side. So much for common sense.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
say that repeatedly when somebody says you need common sense.
Yeah,
Second,
it ain't so common.
Jeremy Black, who's spoken here before, wrote a book about strategy. And one of the things that he said was that the term strategy has been horribly misused. It's come to mean really operational stuff rather than strategic things. And one of the most interesting comments he made was that had Germany thought strategically in World War I and World War II, and had the Confederates thought strategically in the Civil War, none of them would have fought those wars. Because they were going to lose.
No, it's good.
So if you don't mind, before you get to that, Mac, and I apologize for jumping in, but that's exactly why the institution where I work exists. So what we talk about all the time is the concepts you have in your head are determinate. If you don't believe there is such a thing as a strategic level of war, you'll do what the Germans did in 2 world wars. If you don't understand, in 2 world, you won't understand that the military is merely an object to achieve the political dimension, right? You'll do exactly what the Confederates did or exactly what the Germans did. So the statement you just made is kind of our explanation to the U.S. government of why we need to continue to exist. So I wanted to thank you for that.
The last thing is that we talked, I think they call it the long century, 1914 to the end of the Cold War. Did it really end? Are we now in the continuous war from 1914 through today? It's just all one war that we're seeing.
So I'll just say what the Poles would say, which is this starts with Peter the Great and the Romanovs. This starts in the, I'm not kidding. That it's a 17th century quest by the Russians, in their view, to control the fertile lands of Eastern Europe, because if you do that, you control food, and also a consistent Belief by successive Russian governments, regardless of ideology, an idea that George Kennan had too, that if you can't provide basic services to your own people, the way you stay alive is by creating a big demon that's out there, that is responsible for your lousy life. And the Poles will tell you that they've been doing that, the Russians have been doing that since the Romanovs came to power, since the 16th century, since Peter the Great, since Catherine the Great, since Joseph Stalin, since Vladimir Putin. It's just a continuity all the way through. So if you ask the Poles, they'll tell you that chopping up the wars in little pieces makes people in the West feel good about themselves because we won that one, quote unquote. But it's not a way that anybody in Eastern Europe sees these things.
Could I get back to the Jeremy Black quote too? They've never even fought these wars in the first place. This gets to the question that undergraduates asked me for 30 years in the classroom when I was teaching World War II. How could Hitler have won the war? If only he had done this or that. If only he hadn't massacred people. If only he had been more reasonable. So, for example, typically invading the Soviet Union, he could have rallied Ukrainians to his side.
Could have.
There was definitely a space in which the Nazis could have rallied the Ukraine to its side because the German armies were freeing Ukrainians from Soviet rule, Russian rule. But you know, I used to discourage. I used to have a little bit of fun with it. If Hitler was a reasonable guy, he wouldn't have been Hitler. He wouldn't have come to power. He wouldn't have started the war in the first place. He would have said, we are a powerful regional power in Central Europe, but our strategic situation is always going to be dangerous with a heavily armed France on one side and heavily armed Russia on the Soviet Union on the other. And he wouldn't have started the war he started. So, you know, if only there was a different Hitler. And I don't want to make comments. I'm no expert on the U.S. Civil War, but to say that, you know, that there was some kind of strategy, because we hear it all the time. If only such and such had happened on the third day of Gettysburg and this brigade had been placed in a slightly different spot. You've all heard students talk about this. We love these games. We love the what-if games. But, boy, I don't think they have any objective reality. They belong on a tabletop as a game where they're a lot of fun to play out and consider kind of abstract possibilities, but they're not history.
Shelley Foote said that the North fought with one arm kind of on his back.
Yeah.
And had it brought that one out, I mean, it would have been worse.
Probably. Again, I think he's probably right about that.
You want to respond to, Allison? Or?
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, I think that, well, first of all, it kind of seemed like it to your question, Mac. Like, felt like we kind of had accomplished something there for a while. But I also think that just as a general rule, historians can be too wedded to dates, and we fight against that, right? Which is to say, I mean, World War II, you know, when I would teach that class, I would always start the first day, like, when did this war actually start, right? When did this war actually end? And it's a fun, well, it's fun, it's an interesting game to play because there are really no clear answers, and that's equally true of the First World War, and like we tend to cling to these 1914 to 1918, you know, 1939 to 1945, or, you know, 1945 to 1991. I mean, like these kinds of, we want to bookend everything, and it's, you know, to Mike's point about it really goes back to Peter the Great. It's never that simple, and depending on what you're looking at, the end point and starting point and continuation point are going to be different. Yeah. So
we play around a lot with the starting date for World War II at the National World War II Museum.
Yeah.
Because our guests always want to talk about it.
And you got to limit the war somewhat to be able to write a book about it. Or that damn big. Yes, sir.
I knew I was going to ask this when I knew I was coming to this meeting, and this was going to be about World War II. I get that, and you guys love the minutia, but I just learned more about what's coming down the barrel at us in terms of World War III and the Ukraine-Russian conflict from this gentleman about what's going on in Poland, the army and military presence everywhere in Finland, but I haven't heard on television. So what's going to happen?
Uh-oh.
I'm an historian. The last thing we do is predict the future. It is the very last thing that we do.
I like your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Poles and the Estonians have it about right that the next 5 to 7 years is going to be really important. NATO is, of course, built for deterrence. It's not built for war. It's built to keep the Russians from coming into a NATO space. I think we have about 5 to 7 years to make that point to the Russians as clearly as possible. The Poles are doing it right now, that if you want to come this way, you may achieve your objective, but it's going to cost you more than Ukraine cost you, and you're better off just not doing it. The Finns are trying that same approach. I say that, but I had my NATO pen in my pocket and it ran out of ink. But
And there we have it.
but if you know, the next 5 to 7 years is going to be a test to see if the economic and military capabilities of the NATO states can provide that kind of deterrence, can clear what strategists call the deficit of deterrence. I don't want to make any predictions, but I'm reasonably confident that the Western states can do that. But it depends upon, you know, it depends upon Germany actually following through with this so-called Zeitenwende of 100 billion euros for its defense. It depends on successive American governments and senators doing what they're currently doing, which is to say that we're committed to NATO and we're not going to back out of it. It depends on events halfway around the world not happening. So. I'm not convinced that a war is inevitable by any stretch of the imagination, a wider war than the one we already have. But I will say that from the time I showed up at the Army War College, I had been saying since the time I showed up that the defense budget was way too big and the Army ought to get used to a much smaller defense budget. I no longer believe that.
Can I throw in one thing too there, Michael, and it hinges on something that Rob said. I think a lot of this depends on whether Putin is a reasonable person.
So I don't think so. I think this is a Russian problem, not a Putin problem. You know, the Russia folks that I talk to say whoever comes after Putin, the top 100 of those guys, is unlikely to do anything different than what Putin has done. It may even get worse because remember, the Russian Air Force has largely stayed out of this, and of course Russia has that ultimate capability of deploying tactical nuclear weapons, which are cards that are still on the table in Ukraine. So I would love to believe that that's the problem. You get rid of that one individual and you're fine, just like Hitler, right? But I mean, I'm a firm believer. If it wasn't Hitler, it would have been somebody else, right? I mean, the problem wasn't Hitler. The problem was Germany in the interwar period. And I think the same thing is true in Russia.
Anybody else want to jump on that one? Or?
No, I'm good.
Yeah, I hope you don't come to Dale Center Talks to feel better about life. When
It is
the
war
talk
we're
is
talking
over.
I talked about love.
Let's
You
get
did.
to, one of the students in the World War II class. This better be a good question.
I've actually written a paper about the French resistance, so I'd like to ask this question. How effective do you think the French resistance was actually? Like in my research, I've seen that the French resistance was painted in this very romantic
German
image.
side.
I'd like to
Allison
confirm
Abra.
that.
Do you want to?
No, you go ahead.
You know, what we talk about in strategic terms is that when you have small allies like Estonia, they can provide what the phrase is niche capabilities, right? And that's what the French resistance was able to do. Intelligence, a certain sight picture on what the Germans were doing, operations in certain areas at certain times. I think it's also important that it gave a small but incredibly determined number of French men and women an ability to do something, to strike back, and that generation, many of them, became the political leadership of France in the post-war period. So could the Allies have won the war without it? I'm sure they could have. Would France look the same without it? I'm sure it wouldn't.
I just add from the German side, the French resistance was nothing like the problem that the Russian partisans posed by a factor of 10 or 100. I couldn't even, again, playing with numbers. Why am I doing this now? But that's just, again, just comparative, in comparative perspective.
Allison, you want to weigh in?
No, that's fine.
Go to Brian over here and then up here to Doug.
So you had mentioned that relationships between espionage agents had times compromised the war objectives. I was wondering if you could maybe give us some more examples or expand a little bit about some critical situations that you encountered.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few others that I've come across recently. Like in one case, for instance, there was a guy who was attached to one network who had fallen in love with the daughter of a contact in the French resistance, actually, and he was staying in the house with them, or staying in their house, and he was ordered by London to leave and go further north and start a new circuit, and instead he didn't leave because he had a lady, and they basically got attacked in the house, and there was a firefight, and members of the family were badly hurt, and everybody ended up in concentration camps, and he was ultimately executed, in part because he didn't move on when he was supposed to because he had a girlfriend. There's one of his, I read about this incident in a biography of another agent, and the historian who wrote the biography says something about like, because falling in love had messed up his judgment. Effectively, he paid the ultimate price. There's also like, I mean, it's a kind of fine line with a project like this between sort of straying into gossip and actually thinking this through in historical terms, but there's also potentially some evidence you might be familiar with from the many books that have been written about this recently and many movies that have been made, which is part of what I'm interested in this project, is the strong legacy of the women of the SOE in terms of interest in them after the war. One of the more famous is Noorayat Khan, who was a South Asian woman raised in Paris with British connections, and that's how she ended up in SOE. But she famously was like Britain's only radio operator in Paris for a long stretch of time after the circuit there had collapsed. They wanted to pull her out, and she said, no, I'm going to stay. And ultimately, when she was captured, it was because she had been betrayed, and there's evidence that actually she was betrayed by the ex-girlfriend of a guy she had started to date, right? So I mean, like it really, it goes to show. So in some ways, yeah, I think in some ways, it's I guess we have to think about, and this is something I'm still thinking through. So all, thoughts from the audience and the panel welcome. But like, it's what do we mean by consequence, right? Which is to say that overall operations, kind of big picture operations, or the individual security of these people that were already in a very risky situation. Sometimes the kind of choices that they made that are sort of understandable, right? Like looking for, human connection and finding some joy in the midst of a really tough assignment could also imperil them. And love, I think, is just one of many examples of that kind of thing.
I think I would urge you, if you said throw over
yes,
the panel.
Yes, please do.
There's a Clausewitzian aspect to this. Clausewitz is, of course, the Prussian philosopher of war who famously wrote that there is friction in war. You have plans, and you have an ideal course that the operation is going to take, but little things go wrong. Messages don't get where they're supposed to be, the weather turns bad, a crucial bridge washes out, whatever it might be, and suddenly the operation kind of grinds to a halt. Well, the specifics of having men and women working in tight and dangerous situations together, one of the potential frictions is that things are going to go off the rails, and there's going to be a lost 15 minutes or whatever it might be, and that could be crucial to the further course of the operation. So that's
I have missed being on
thought.
panels with you.
Clausewitz. I mean, I feel like I had to shout out the name Clausewitz. So.
Dr. Bushman, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to make reference to an example that Rob Citino got to pose a question to the whole panel, and that was, I think Matt Delmont's book is very well written. And I was very anxious. I'm writing a book about black GIs in service units. And fortunately, like all other authors of black soldiers, he just forgot about them. Yeah. And so here's the question to you. It seems to me, in terms of recent time, COVID taught us about the importance of supply chains. Mm-hmm. A lot of those supply chains were invented during World War II. Yes. And that's really why we won the war, was this amazing feat of delivering all this fuel and equipment. And when are we going to see, it just seems to me unbelievable how undeveloped the literature is on logistics and supply. Well, even now, and this is the first war where the number of people in support services surpass combat, and it never changes that.
I could probably name a few books, but you're right. And no one's ever going to make a movie called Supplying Private Ryan. It's just not. It's not a winner. It's just for the obvious reasons. But you're quite right. World War II kind of invented logistics. The Navy first used the term, and General Marshall famously said, Admiral King, what's he always talking about? Logistics. We got to get some of that. The Army has to get some logistics. He didn't even know what it meant. He thought it was something you bought or some kind of item. So it's the crucial question of modern war. It's certainly the crucial question for Russian forces in Ukraine today, and Ukrainian forces in Ukraine today, I might add. But it's always been crucial. Napoleon said an army marches on his stomach, by which he meant only supplied troops will march at all. If you don't feed them, they're not going anywhere. And I think all of us who write operational history like to do arrows, push around pieces on a chalkboard, but you should always ask yourself whether it's possible to make the move that your pieces on the chalkboard are making. If the logistics aren't there, nothing happens at all. So I don't really have a good answer to your question except to say it's an arcane and technical topic. And for that reason, it's difficult to get publishers interested in a book on logistics.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. there's some great dissertations that have been
Yes,
done,
yeah,
great
of course.
articles. It's just
Yeah.
really hard to, it is incredibly technical.
I would say too that another way to maybe kind of work it in, when we were talking about sort of what's new and so forth, and I was thinking during Rob's remarks, one of the things that's happening a lot in British history right now are big books about the war again. So Alan Allport and Daniel Todman, they've written these like sort of 2 volumes in that case, not 3 volumes.
Richard Overy has a single volume.
Yes,
quite
exactly.
recently,
But
yeah.
one of the things that Alan says, and so maybe this is what I mean about, you can slip it in if it's like a bigger book about other things, because one of the things he said that I never knew but is so interesting is that when we think about the Battle of the Atlantic, the really sexy parts are convoys and U-boats, right? That's what you're thinking about. But when in terms of actually keeping Britain supplied in order to survive the blockade, the crucial thing was port logistics, right? How do you get all this stuff off the ships? And I had never really thought about that, and yeah, it is very important.
How you package it. You
Yeah.
take the things you need least and put them in first.
Yeah.
And you take the things you need most and put them in last. It's the opposite way you pack the family car to go on a vacation. And here's what we got to have. You put all the things in, you throw everything on top of it. But I'll just second what Mike said. It's a very technical topic, even
Yeah.
port logistics. Right?
Yes, but if you include it in a much bigger book
As
about
a-
the war,
Yes, yeah, that's right.
then you can kind of sneak it in. Yeah.
Well, sadly, we have time for only one more question, and they're all over the place, but let's go right here.
If we do end up going into a third world war, do you think nuclear weapons will be involved, or do you think mutually assured destruction will scare them off of that?
So there's what the military facetiously refers to as dial-a-nukes. That is, nuclear weapons are unusual in that you can customize the amount of pain that you want them to deliver. So there are strategic nuclear weapons that can be delivered halfway around the world at a city. There are dial-a-nukes, which are very small, that can be used on a battlefield. To the best of my knowledge, what we're talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons in the Ukraine-Russia is the smaller tactical nuclear weapons that would be used in Ukraine. I would like to tell you that I think the concepts of deterrence that were built into the Cold War continue to govern the world today. I think that that's true. There are those who have also argued that if the Russians, the nuclear weapons have prevented the Ukraine war from spreading conventionally. That is, Poland and other NATO states don't want to get involved because Russia has these weapons. I don't think that's all that's going on, but that's it. So my gut tells me you're right, or the premise of your question is right, that the strategic nuclear weapons, the concepts of deterrence still function. But like I said, the reason historians, there's a famous historian, Collingwood, who said historians never make any predictions because we don't want to open ourselves up to any more ridicule than is absolutely necessary. So I would say that's kind of my gut feeling now on May 4th, 2023. The situation could become quite fluid and quite dynamic.
I'm going to defer to you on that one. Yeah.
You know, we're making our last big, building our last big pavilion at the National World War II Museum, and it's on the liberation. So broadly conceived, it's the legacies of World War II for the present day. And we have a text panel on the wall, which is the famous quote from President Reagan: "Freedom is only one generation away from extinction." And the way we placed it, in the current design, it's the last thing you will see as you leave the National World War II Museum, the word extinction. It strikes me, Gunther Anders, a German philosopher, was writing in the 1950s about the possibility of nuclear war. He coined the term omnicide. You know, kill everything. It'll just kill everything. And if it kills everything, it'll destroy meaning. There won't be meaning. We won't even be able to talk about it. Maybe somewhere in a cave somebody will survive, but there'll be no way to even talk about it.
Bring this up.
I'm thinking of extinction and omnicide. I can't believe we're thinking about these thoughts here in
I think that's it.
2023. There's something called the Whig theory of history, that everything's getting better. We were smart then, now we're smarter, and we're getting smarter, and we'll be smarter tomorrow. But you just realize as you go through life, and I'm approaching my 65th birthday, that's really a crock.
Yeah, that's
so
the way it works.
if I can say one thing, don't subscribe to the Whig theory of history.
Yeah, because my default answer, but I can't justify it at all, so I liked what Mike said, because I was like, yes. That's what I just thought in my head. But I have nothing to back that up. So let's go, yes. Deterrence still works.
Yeah.
Well, I wish we had time for everybody's questions, but sadly we are out of time. I'd like to have you guys thank our panelists, Dr. Abra, Citino, and Neiberg.
Great audience. Great audience.
And good questions, Andy.
That's it.